So Michelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Olga, and it's an absolute pleasure to be invited here today to talk about the development of inclusive education in Kazakhstan. So what I'm going to do, I've just got about 6 slides that I want to run through today just briefly, and I'll just share my screen with that now and bring up that for you. And please don't worry about the disruption. This is just part and parcel, I think, of life these days in Zoom land. So my name is Michelle Somerton. I'll start with my introduction. I've been in Kazakhstan for almost 4 years, and I came from the University of Tasmania in Australia, where I was teaching in inclusive education in the Australian context. So the move to Central Asia and Kazakhstan was a little different for me. And, you know, working and living in this context has actually, I think, been quite an enhancement to my understanding of the field more broadly, or, you know, globally speaking. So this afternoon or this morning, depending on where we are in the world, I'm going to just talk briefly about the development of the inclusive education movement, the dominant models of disability as they relate to specifically how they're understood in the Central Asian context, and the kind of research that is happening in Kazakhstan, either by myself or by some of my students. Thank you. So inclusive education really developed, as probably many of you know, out of the idea of special needs education. And it really began with the Salamanca Statement. And what really defined the difference in thinking between the idea of special needs education and inclusive education was that children or students face barriers to learning in more ways than just disability. And what defined the thinking between special needs education and inclusive education was that it was moving the responsibility onto schools and teachers in the way that they thought about providing educational supports or removing barriers to learning for many students. So one of the most important parts of the Salamanca Statement that came out was that it was the regular school that was the place, the best place to be able to combat discriminatory attitudes and to develop inclusive education or inclusive societies more broadly. So when we think about inclusive education today, it's much broader than how it's actually, you know, from the seed it came out of, which is special education. So it's understanding that many face barriers to education in a multitude of ways. And those barriers we just set up.
I apologize.
Okay.
The host, could you please block the iPhone SE participant? Sorry about that.
No, that's fine. So I'll continue. That we can look at the first picture here, where we see if we provide the same things to all students, then, you know, that's equality. But when we talk about the second picture, when we think about providing that some students need additional supports more than other students, that's when we get to the idea of equity. Now, the third one, I think, which is the most important one, is understanding that we can remove those barriers almost altogether, so that there's no need for more effort for some students than others. And that's where we get onto inclusive pedagogies. So from the perspective, if we go back to the Salamanca Statement and talking about the regular school, that's when it brings us to the medical model and the social model of disability. Now, one of the key features of the medical model of disability is that the deficit is within the individual. So it's about correcting the individual to fit the system. Where we look at the social model of disability, that's more about changing the system to support the needs of the individual. Okay, and specifically when it comes to disability. And I talk about disability because in this context of Kazakhstan, the idea of inclusive education is still under development. And it's come a long way in the 4 years since I arrived. It was very much heavily disability focused, but over the last several years, there's been more of an understanding in the ministries, in the Ministry of Education, about the idea of inclusive education. There's more and more teachers talking about inclusive education. There's a push to have 70% of schools become inclusive. But again, this idea, there's still parts of the community that are very resistant. There's parts, there's attitudes and beliefs that are still firmly rooted in that medical model of disability, of that idea that the child must be corrected, rather than looking at systemic ways that children can be supported to stay and be educated in their mainstream classes. Now, I'm not saying that the mainstream classroom, I believe, is the right place for every single child. You know, I believe, particularly coming from the Australian system, what is first and foremost most important is that parents have a choice of where they feel is best, where their child is best educated. So rather than that decision being taken out of their hands by PMPCs, psychological, medical and pedagogical commissions, where people are deciding where that child should be educated or should be homeschooled, that parents are taking more of, or recognizing more of their rights in regards to current legislation in Kazakhstan. So some of the key themes, and I've just put a selection here in no particular order. These are the kinds of research projects that our students are working on here in Kazakhstan. Aman is in the final stages of his PhD. And he's looking at vocational education in a higher education context. We have Kimbat, she's completed her master's that was looking at supporting children from orphanages in the mainstream classrooms. So the specific features of this research are looking at children with autism, parents, teachers' attitudes, and looking at support systems in educational context. So then coming over to my current research and what I've been working on while I've been here, one of the most recent publications that that came out just in March, actually, with a couple of colleagues, Daniel and Janet, was looking at the development of inclusive education since Salamanca. And what we're really seeing, and we're seeing that also reflected in some of the research projects that are being taken on here in Kazakhstan as well, is that separation between the idea of disability and inclusive education. So on one hand, you know, the bibliometric review that we did, it's a specific methodology of mapping the field, showed that decoupling between disability or special needs education and inclusive education. So we can see that very, very clearly. And that's what we're starting to see here in Kazakhstan as well. So we're getting to see, looking at the problems associated or the challenges associated with developing inclusive education in higher education contexts, which is something that this theme is developing globally, that same theme. Now, a research project that Camilla Rowland, one of my master's students, she's now graduated and she's started her PhD at Cambridge University. She was looking at her research from the perspective of parental activism and the role that parents play as part of NGOs in contributing towards the development of inclusive education. So looking at it from a grassroots perspective rather than the formal top-down, you know, hierarchical model of education we typically believe that is in operation in Kazakhstan. Another more recent publication was looking at the development of resource centres. This was a project that we took on within Nazarbayev University Graduate School of Education, and also working in tandem with DARA, who is an NGO working in Kazakhstan on the development of supporting children and families with additional needs. So looking at the development of resource centres and how those kinds of centres can actually provide a support for teachers, for parents, and the way that they were actually operating within the Kazakhstani context. Another research project I did last year was within Nazarbayev University, and that was also looking at the development of inclusive education in a higher education context. So the vision and the mission of the university here is to be able to provide a model for higher education for other universities across across Kazakhstan. And so the kinds of initiatives that we have are basically what we share with other universities. We do quite a bit of mini workshops and quite a bit of sort of like professional development for those in other higher education contexts, in looking at ways that they can develop more social systems or socially oriented systems towards supporting students. And another project that I've been working on recently as well, we've just finished all the data collection and analysis on this project, was actually the understanding medical professionals' attitudes and beliefs towards autism and the diagnostic process of autism in Kazakhstan. Now, we know that global averages are or the averages or the numbers that we have of diagnosed in Kazakhstan are nothing like what we see in other parts of the world in respect of diagnosis of autism. And so we really wanted to investigate that process and find out from psychiatrists and pediatric neurologists and defectologists and medical doctors just what their attitudes were towards autism and their beliefs about autism. And what we found with that project was that there still is a major kind of stigma around a diagnosis of autism, that it's seen still by some in the medical profession as being the same as schizophrenia. Now we know that research from other parts of the world, earlier in the 21st century, was pretty much, saying that the rates of schizophrenia in children or people diagnosed with autism is no different than the general population. So it's still seeing that kind of idea around mental illness or schizophrenia associated with autism is still a sense of shame for many families. It's still problematic and people actually seeking diagnosis, and the process of diagnosis itself is very, very lengthy. So they're just some of the current research projects that we've been working on here in the Kazakhstani context, and there's a lot more that I could talk about, but with 10 minutes or so, I think that gives you a bit of an overview of the kind of research work that we've been doing, or that I've been doing over the last 4 years here. As I said, I could talk about a lot of these projects in far more detail, particularly on aspects of the conceptualization of collaboration and how collaboration is understood in the Kazakhstani context. It's a very unidisciplinary kind of approach rather than a interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary team kinds of approach to collaboration. So there's many, many dimensions to each of these projects. So I'll be happy to answer questions later on in the presentation.
Thank you so much, Michelle. This has been wonderful. We are very excited to hear about your other projects as well, but the introduction of your existing projects, and it was wonderful. So I will just reiterate to the guests that are joining us, please introduce yourself in the chat And because of the Zoom bombing incidents, we will be removing any participant without a name and a surname. So please make sure you introduce yourself, and we are very thankful to have you here. We have quite a diverse crowd of professors from Kazakhstan and Russia, and who are based in Finland, and we are very excited that you are here with us. So the next speaker is Madina Karsakpaeva. She's a doctoral student in Hungary, and Madina is quite a unique student. She's one of the only students with physical disabilities who is studying abroad from Kazakhstan. We are very, very happy to have you here with us today. So thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. I'm really happy to join you all today. As Olga already mentioned, I'm a student, a PhD student in Hungarian university called ELTE University in the Faculty of Special Education, but my PhD topic is more on inclusion, focused on inclusion. And I think I will be sharing my screen and stopping my video, to save the energy of this Zoom program. 1 second.
Все, я работаю, пожалуйста.
Ладно, что тебе жалко?
Я работаю.
Ладно, ладно.
Could please participants mute their microphones, or the host will mute everyone. But we are just trying to be more inclusive, so we could and everything. But Madina, are you ready?
Yes, I'm trying to share my screen.
We see it.
Could you see it? Yeah. Okay. So the topic of inclusive education, of inclusion, is really tightly related to my own life, and I think that the big motivation and desire to work in this field comes or supports by my own experience. And in the first slide, here you see the title of my work. Sorry, I'm trying to. Okay, so this is still working title, a part of my PhD work related to higher education inclusion, and it's focused on Kazakhstani context. Sorry. I'm just providing some of the information on Kazakhstan in terms of disability and numbers, that we have more than 500,000 people living with different type of needs, a level of needs. And I think there's also a huge part of mentality, a huge impact of mentality, which still exists, which is supported again by medical model of disability, and people like myself and others who really differ from the rest of the society is being treated in a very, sometimes in a very negative way, which means students and kids with disabilities, starting from their birth, they have very limited number of educational opportunities. So here I just provide the rationale or the reasons, justification for my research on higher education inclusion. As I already mentioned, I was born with cerebral palsy, or disability, type of disability, which forced me at some point to go through homeschooling experience, which still, unfortunately, I think, is a dominating option when it comes to school education for kids with disabilities. Additionally, I support my study with development, just begin, how to say, development of inclusive education as a field in Kazakhstan, as well as the 5th anniversary of ratification of the UN Convention, which promotes the rights of people with disabilities and in different areas, including education, employment, and other important areas. The other, I think, crucial point why I want to bring this question is that during my master degree program, I was trying to touch this topic again, higher education inclusion, how students with disabilities in Kazakhstan are involved. Since we have still existing, remaining after USSR, kind of legacy of disability categorization, we do have these three types of disability groups, which are differently represented in education in general. But when it comes to higher education, in recent documents, it seems that people with first group of disability who considered to be less able to do anything in general are less represented. So that was one of the, big motivations and big reasons why I want to discover this or study this issue, and to understand the reasons why this category of people, the first group of disabilities, kind of left, is outside of the education, of higher education. Some of the objectives, study objectives, or additionally, I just put some information on the disability and higher education, as I already mentioned. There is some information about the distribution between numbers, but still, this document had monitored only, I think, 64 or 66 universities across the country, across Kazakhstan, and they don't provide detailed information on what type of disability has been considered as the first group, second, and third. In terms of theoretical framework, I'm going to use social model of disability. As I already mentioned, UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled Persons with Disabilities, and some other theoretical theories as a human development model of disability, but just a depiction what social model means and why I choose it. In terms of study location, I think it would be logical to locate my study in Almaty, which is the biggest city in the country, and it has not only general big population, but the biggest population of people who have disabilities. And majority of universities, as well as NGOs and any other disability related organizations located here. Obviously, it will be qualitative research, hearing the voices of those who have been hidden or stigmatized is really important, and it may provide, more insight for higher education institutions to think about inclusion part in their work, inclusion and diversity policies by the universities, as well as my main focus is first group of disability. And sorry, next. Okay, my research questions. I think I just mixed my slides, but these are the three main questions I'm going to put as a part of my research project, and some information on data collection through interviews. I think, considering the current situation on COVID-19, it might be useful to use Skype interviews or any other means of internet. Data analysis. In terms of outcomes or results, I think identification this least represented group of disability in higher education and the reasons, and also, faculty awareness to help universities to work in more inclusive environment, to raise their awareness level, and to contribute to inclusive education policy in higher education institutions in Kazakhstan. So sorry if I was too quick, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. And thank you for your attention.
So there was one question that I think we can address now, and then the rest we will address in the Q&A session. So Mirjahan Turdiyev has a question whether there are any regional or Central Asian associations of inclusive education specialists that you're aware of, and if there is no such organization, perhaps could we organize one, or are there any plans to establish one?
I honestly personally always look for these kind of communities or unions, and I think there is no, as far as I know, but I'm really happy to join and maybe to organize one, so we can share our our research, our work, and ideas for future projects. Yep.
Thank you so much, Medina. Wonderful. And I have a few questions about research design that I will ask later. But for now, we are transitioning to our second doctoral speaker. So Galina. Galina is doing research in Uzbekistan, and her research focuses on inclusive education practices there. She's connecting with us today from New Zealand, and we are very happy to have her. And I'll be helping Galina to share a presentation. So just give me 1 second. I will connect my screen. Please let me know also if you see my screen. So, okay, I'm ready. Galina?
Can you hear me now? Sorry.
Yes.
Can you? Okay. Sorry. Thank you, Olga. My name is Galina, and I'm a doctoral student and doing my study at the University of Kato. And my research is about inclusive education policies for children with disabilities in Uzbekistan. And a major focus of my study is on cooperation among the government, NGOs, disability-related NGOs, families, and teachers of both general and specialized schools. Can we go to the first slide, Olga? Yeah, thank you. It's just very briefly about the country, though I think that many of you already know. Uzbekistan is a small landlocked country located in Central Asia. So the country's population is about almost 33 million, with the Uzbeks a dominant ethnic group. So we speak two languages, Uzbek and Russian, and the form of the government is the Presidential Constitutional Republic. In 1991, the country declared its independence from the Soviet Union. And after being a part of the Soviet Union for nearly 70 years, we have inherited a lot of things from the previous system, including policies and practices regarding people with disabilities in our country. Can we go to the next slide, Olga? And unfortunately, in Uzbekistan, we still widely practice those practices that were common in the Soviet Union. So officially, we have more than 100 children with disabilities under 18 years old in the country. But here I emphasize that this is a number of official registered children, and nobody really knows how many children unregistered we have in the country. And I do remember during my data collection, I had an interview with one of the disability activists. And so he said he had participated in a project, and the aim of the project was to identify children with visual impairments in the capital city in Tashkent. And he said only for a few days, within a few districts, we found 20 blind children who basically did not officially exist. They didn't have any documents, no certificates, no passports, nothing. So if it happened in the capital city, so I assume that the situation in remote areas is much worse. And if you have a look on this chart, so we can see that the education for those who are officially registered is predominantly segregated. We had in 2014, we had only 5.4% of them included in regular schools, and the rest of children were either assigned to home-based education or were placed in segregated institutions. Recently, I think a year ago, the number was different, and the same ministry claims that now we have 56% of them included in regular schools. And in my study, I claim that this number, such a rapid increase from 5% to 56% in a country with a widely practiced medical model of disability, and the country that only recently has started its disability reforms, is hardly possible. I will not go into details now due to time limit, but if you have any questions about the statistics, I will be happy to address at the end. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. And with the development of inclusive education agenda, of course, the government of Uzbekistan could not stand aside. And so the government has also attempted to implement inclusive education. We have signed and ratified some major international treaties. And in addition to that, there have been some practical attempts to implement inclusive education with the support of international donors. And one of the recent projects was sponsored and organized by the European Union. And as far as I know, it's being administered now by the Republican Center for Social Adaptation of Children in Uzbekistan currently. So we can see that the government has made certain efforts to implement inclusive education in Uzbekistan, but these practices seem not to be sustainable. Can we go to the next slide? So very briefly about my research. So the main question of my research is how do participants, and by participants I mean, as I said, government representatives, teachers, parents, and non-governmental agencies working in the disability area. So how they understand the notion of inclusive education and how that understanding can promote or maybe hinder the development of full inclusion of children with disabilities in our country. My study is largely qualitative with a small quantitative dimension. So I employed a web-based questionnaire for disability-related agencies and semi-structured interviews for the rest of participants. And during my data collection, I received 6 responses from NGOs. I think we have sent to 11 or 15 organizations. And by the way, Mirjahon has helped me to organize my data collection. So I sent to more than 10 and we received 6 responses back, and I interviewed 23 participants. I also visited 2 specialized schools, and 2 of them were in Tashkent and 1 in the region. And I also had an access to the national program for the development of inclusive education. I think ideally the government documents have to be available to public, but it's not our case. I had to apply for permission to get access to the documents, but I fortunately was given this. And here on the picture you can see, so it's one of the specialized, on the first picture it's a primary school student, and when I was there they were making the letters out of a Play-Doh. And on the second picture, you can see high school students of the same school. So the main focus of education for children with intellectual disabilities is on the development of their vocational skills. So this is one of the workshops at school, I think. Yep. Well, can we go to the next slide, please? So perception of inclusive education. In general, like almost all participants had the right understanding of what inclusive education was, and their definitions were mainly about the acceptance and equality. Though the understanding of parents was limited to education for children with disabilities only, while the government officials and NGOs, they had a broader understanding of inclusion. So they said that inclusion is basically for everyone, for every child, including those from different marginalized groups. However, many parents complained that while leading specialists in the country are still confused between integrated education and inclusive education. And they said that simply in many projects, what they saw, the children were placed in separated classes in general schools with no provision of services, with no adjusted curriculum, and with no communication with other children, which is the main purpose of inclusive education. And many of them were frustrated, and they said, we just got our children from so-called inclusive education and placed them back in specialized schools. And I think Roger Slee, you might have read his articles. He's one of the prominent Australian researchers in the field of inclusive education, and he gives a very good, a very exact definition of this phenomenon. He said it's an exclusion with an inclusion. So this is what was happening in Uzbekistan recently with all these inclusive education initiatives. Challenges. Stigma appeared to be one of the most serious ones, so social stigma. So I'll give you a few seconds to read. So this is what mother of a daughter of the Down syndrome said. So she said, after I had a baby, I came home and my mother-in-law said, there is no way that my healthy son will have an unhealthy baby. And if you have two options, option number one, you can get a baby and leave us. We will go for divorce. And option number two, you can stay in a family, but in that case, you need to find another healthy baby. You need to exchange them secretly. No one will know, no relatives, no neighbors or friends will know about that. And she said, I decided to go for option number two. And I and my husband, we were going from one orphanage to another orphanage, trying to find a suitable baby. I'm not sure that the word suitable is appropriate when we talk about children, but this is what she meant. So she said it should be a child of the same gender, the same age, and the same ethnicity. So she said it took us 4 months to find a baby. We found the girl, we went through the adoption process. We went our own child in the orphanage and we brought a new one home. And when I brought a new child home, she said, only at that moment I realized what I had done. And she said, I understood that I would not be able to live with all of that. And I approached my husband that evening and I said, I'm ready for divorce. So if you would like to leave, you can leave, because tomorrow I'm getting my child back. He fortunately stayed with the family and they got the child back, but it was not an easy decision for him. She said it was the first time when I saw him crying. So what is important here, I think, to know the cultural context is very important when we talk about a disability. And this is one of my recommendations for the research, to investigate the culture, the cultural context, because the more we know about it, the better intervention strategies we can offer to families, to people, especially to people who belong to all the generations. And it was not the only case. There were many similar cases, not exactly the same, but many similar cases when mothers of children with disabilities were rejected and they were stigmatized. And some of them said even that that was a time when we were thinking about committing to suicide. And one of mothers, I think she said a very important thing. It's one of the highlights of my research. She said, a child has to be accepted by family first. If we as family members cannot accept a child with a disability, what can we expect from the rest of society? So social stigma should be investigated deeper. This is what I recommend at the end of my research. Medicalization of a disability. Difficulty. So it's based on the assumption that the child cannot develop and he needs special conditions and special curriculum to learn something. And many parents complain. So they said, you cannot imagine how much effort we spent on going through the medical committee, getting a permission from them to place a child in a general school. And when we come there, so what was told is, what can you expect from the child, and what, because he will not develop anyway, and what do you expect from us? So that was quite widespread attitude in both kindergartens and general schools. And one of the parents said, so she placed her child in a general school, and when other kids were learning for something, her child was taking. So if it was a winter time, he was kept in a bedroom, and if it was summertime, he was taken outside. So he never participated in the learning process with all of other children. So this is the approach that is still very common in Uzbekistan. Financial struggles. So all parents were in the opinion that the current disability allowance is not enough. And during the interview, when I talked to parents, they said, what development opportunities are you talking about? Because we simply do not have enough resources to survive. And this is what one of the parents said. The price to commute from school and to school is equal to the price of 2 loaves of bread. And of course, families who struggle financially, they would rather buy bread rather than send a child to school. There were many cases like this. And this is also one of my recommendations, that the financial provision for parents of children with disabilities has to be reconsidered. Teachers. So teachers mainly said that children with intellectual disabilities cannot be studied at school. It was not very surprising to hear that from teachers of specialized schools, but I was quite surprised to hear that from non-governmental organizations that actually participated in inclusive education projects. And they said no. So mainly of them said no inclusion for children with intellectual disabilities, and the best place for them is to stay in specialized schools. And they said there are 2 main reasons. First, there is they do not have, as they said, intact intellect. So it means they do not have cognitive abilities to study with others. And the second reason, they said, they can be very disruptive for others. And if they scream or make a lot of noise, so it can be, they can bother others, and it will affect the academic progress of other students. Lack of expertise for teachers. That was also a major reason. So, major reason the teachers said that we're actually afraid of this of these children. And it's also recommendations for teachers from both specialized but mainly from general schools. They need to, so their professional development opportunities, they also have to be reconsidered. The teachers complain that there are no conditions, mostly overcrowded classes, and it's really difficult to teach multi-level overcrowded classes. And they said we cannot even imagine, if we have 40 plus students in the class, we cannot even imagine on top of this to have even 1 or 2 students with disabilities. Lack of parental care. That was a major complaint from teachers of specialized schools. They said that many families, they said, so in average 1 out of 12 students at school come from socially and financially secure families, and the rest of them come from very low social, from families with very low social status. And they said parents mainly, those parents, they mainly impose their parental responsibilities on us, and we do a lot of things for them. We feed these children, we trim their nails, we cut the hair, we take them to the theater, to the circus. So those functions that schools are not supposed to do. One of the teachers said that so they actually do not need their children And so he said children for them are just byproducts of these sexual activities. And if they had had a chance not to have these children at all, they wouldn't have had them. But they were born, and the easiest way to get rid of these children was just to send them to a specialized school. As for disability NGOs, they said there is a lack of partnership with the government because the government does not trust us. Olga, can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, so these are some of my recommendations. I will not go through all of them. I'll probably talk about the professional support for teachers and support and education for parents of children with disabilities. So for professional support for pre-service teachers, it's mainly include a new program with the inclusive education component in it. When I had a data collection, one of the implementers of inclusive education projects, they started this survey for pre-service teachers, and they found out that many of them are not familiar even with the concept of inclusive education. And those who are familiar, they said that no, children with disabilities cannot be included. They need to send to specialized schools. And if this is said by pre-service teachers who tomorrow will be practicing teachers, so we can imagine the results of inclusive education initiatives. And that's why, so by that time they applied with a request for the Ministry of Higher Education to add the inclusive education component to the current curriculum. I do not know the results, but as far as I know, that the program has not been implemented yet. So that should be definitely a program for pre-service teachers. For in-service teachers, as I have already briefly mentioned, it should be more professional development opportunities. So far we have, and we have had a lot of different initiatives here and there, and people are trying to organize something with the support of international organizations. But I think the problem is none of those programs have been mainstreamed into the national program. And if it's not in the national program, so we cannot talk about sustainability. For parents of children with disabilities, so the main thing for them is financial provision. As I said, it should be reconsidered. The second thing is I strongly advocate for respite care for parents. I think respite care is not developed in the majority of developing countries, and Uzbekistan is no exception. So respite care is when a social worker can substitute parents for a few hours or for a day to take up parental responsibilities. And it might be very, very helpful, because when teachers complained about parents' irresponsibility, I think it's very easy to oversimplify that situation and position those parents as deliberately neglectful of their children. But I think if we think about all those emotional, physical, and psychological stress they have, so respite care might be very helpful in that case. Education for parents of children with disabilities also should be considered. I think it should include some specific skills, training certain specific skills that their children might require. The importance of early intervention programs also should be included. And also the knowledge of disability related laws, because it was also one of the problems when many parents, they come to look for advocacy, but they themselves did not know much about laws and regulations related to children with disabilities to help and support them. So this is briefly about my study, very, very briefly. And I just want to conclude that we have faced a lot, and we're still facing a lot of obstacles. And so I do understand that inclusive education cannot be implemented very, very quickly, because we need time, we need a lot of efforts, and we need resources. But I think inclusive education is not only about resources, it's mainly about political will, because we largely depend on the government decision in terms of implementation of inclusive education in a country. And it's also, I think inclusion is also about advocacy. because from the history of disability, we know a lot of examples when disability-related organizations or when families of children with disabilities, they strongly advocate for inclusion and they push the government to make certain steps in that direction. That's all briefly, and if you have any questions, I will be lucky to address them at the end. Olga?
Yes, so thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm done.
Thank you so much, Galina. So we will proceed to the third speaker because of the time constraints, and then we'll have a joint Q&A at the end. So please, Janat is a doctoral student at the University of Bristol. Janat is in her fourth year, so she will share with us her findings from her doctoral dissertation. So Janat, please.
Okay. I'm sorry, I can't find my presentation to share.
Not to worry, take your time. Just to repeat the questions, so please do keep the discussion going. And we have additional questions from colleagues from Loughborough University that we will discuss them at the end of our session. Thank you for staying with us despite the challenges. We appreciate it. So, Janat is ready.
Mm-hmm. So just a moment, please. Oops. Yeah. Thank you very much, Olga, for introducing me. Can you hear me well? Just to check.
Yes, yes, all is well.
Good. Thank you. My name is Janat. I'm a doctoral student at University of Bristol in the United Kingdom. I'm very pleased and glad to take part in today's webinar and be part of the researchers community studying the topic of inclusive education in Central Asia. My research topic is about parental engagement in child's learning, and the context of my research is inclusive education development in Kazakhstan. And I'm looking at how parental engagement is conceptualized in policy documents and also how parents experience their engagement themselves. Research suggests that parental engagement can be understood as a continuum. It has the aspects of involvement with child's school, the activities that parents do with coming to school, volunteering there, engaging in school-related activities. And also it has the aspect of involvement with child schooling, which is doing the homeworks together with the children, and the parental engagement with child's learning, which is that can happen at out of school space, and which is the most important part of parental engagement to understand. And in order to build the partnership relationship between home and school, it's important that both partners from both sides place their attention on the engagement in child's learning, which is child's overall development. This is my children and me, our engagement activities together. My research interest comes from my own experience as well. I come from Eastern traditional hierarchical culture of family relationships, which is far from partnership. And I was interested in looking at how parenting labor, is it gendered or not, or how parents work in relation to each other. And also my non-English speaking children, we came here and they started school here. So for my own strive for inclusive education enhanced based on the experiences we've got here in the UK schools. So I was also very much interested to learn parental engagement strategies based on my own experience. Parental engagement research says that it's not easy to implement and understand, because there's always issues of power relations between professionals and parents, because parents, they as they interact with their social world, they always face with barriers, different kind of, and parental engagement is usually understood from school-based perspective and evaluated from this perspective, usually based on what parents do coming to school, and they're evaluated based on like if they don't conform to the school practices, they may be seen as hard to reach. So my theoretical framework for my own study, I use the ecological perspective, looking at parental roles, their identities, and what are the available capital for them in different spaces. So I look broadly, mainly at parental contexts that allow them or inhibit their engagement. I designed my research in 2 stages. I looked at policy documents that on inclusive education. Mainly, I reviewed 17 guidelines for inclusive education implementation in organizations. I also looked at intertextually at strategic document on education development and on the law of education. I use the critical discourse analysis for my policy review because it helps looking at how language creates and can be created by social practices, and it helps to identify the parents' representation in these documents. In the second stage, I conducted in-depth interviews with 11 mothers. I did this via Skype, WhatsApp interviews, and I looked at their focus life histories, and I looked at their experiences based on the first stage of based on the findings from the first stage. So my first stage informed the second stage. I thematically analyzed my interviews and used in vivo coding software. So briefly talking, currently I'm at the stage of writing up my findings, my analysis chapter. So my findings from policy analysis are that parental engagement is conceptualized from school perspective and from as one way rather than partnership. Although the partnership discourse and education modernization discourses are presented. So the partnership discourse in documents presented mainly in the guidelines, in manuals, while in state document and law, it is mostly from one direction, from state to parents. So there are conflicts between at the policy levels, and it's also introduced as a end product rather than process. So just parents, what parents should do, how parents are seen, like as a resources, as those who are responsible for their children, but how to understand these processes, and also what are the context for parents. It's not discussed in the policy documents. And also parents are mainly introduced as a homogeneous entity, and so their social cultural backgrounds are not taken into account. And from findings from my interviews, I looked at the experiences with accessing education, and my interview findings revealed that they have limited access, as Professor Michel mentioned previously. They face a lot of huge barriers in terms of making decisions as partners about their school children's placement. And this is mainly structural barriers imposed by PMPC, pedagogical, medical, psychological consultation, sorry. And so in many cases, mothers talk about their compromises in order to get the right place for their children. So although the concept of inclusion is understood as in a broad terms. All mothers discuss their wishes, preferences for mainstream inclusion, but in reality they face the difficulties and they have to compromise in many cases and place their children to the special schools or correctional classes. But there are also many parents who are striving for inclusion and doing their best at their parents' level, creating the alternative spaces for their children's inclusion. And also another big theme is how parents actually communicate with school. And my findings suggest that in many cases what policy documents suggest are not implemented in practice. So parents, the discourse of partnership is far in reality in the practice. So many mothers talked about their endorsed engagement from their side. So it's usually parents who come to school and wants the communication to take place, and they want their expertise to be listened to and experiences, because many mothers they also have experiences in both special and their experiences in education. So also another big theme is in many cases mothers establish their own strategies, and they're based on their own motivational beliefs, and they do a lot of activities at the same time. They have to take different roles at the same time, and their roles as their parenting roles can be set as gendered, because in many cases they face the stigma from their family members, extended family members, and others in the society. So, and there is a lot happening to mothers. So yeah, this is briefly about my findings and current stage of my research. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nat. So this was our third doctoral presentation. So I think we will now transition to the discussion, but also if Professor Somerton would like to reiterate some of the points that unfortunately suffered because of the disruption, you're more than welcome to do so. So the first question that we had was from colleagues from FINALBERA University. So they texted me the question on dyslexia awareness in Kazakhstan. And this question was for Professor Somerton. If you could please elaborate on this.
Certainly, I'd be happy to. So that I think was on one of my slides. One of our master's students was looking at teachers' knowledge of dyslexia for a start. And that was one of the points, you know, when I was thinking about, you know, our presentations this afternoon, is that when we talk about barriers to learning, you know, many of the barriers to learning are hidden. So looking at the obvious, you know, we have a student that may need a wheelchair, or we have a student that may need a cochlear implant, or we have a student, you know, these things are really obvious. But when it comes to things, you know, diagnoses like autism or dyslexia, these things are hidden. And because of a lack of understanding, a lack of training, and that just is not in the educational sphere, that's also in the medical sphere. You know, my research has crossed across from the educational into the medical sphere. And, you know, the kinds of understandings, the kind of training, the kind of knowledge has not kept pace with contemporary research across these fields, both in the educational sphere and also in the medical sphere. So the understanding about things like dyslexia are not widely known by teachers. And so what we're getting now, and I think one of our speakers raised the importance of, you're looking at universities, I think it was Galina? No, not Galina. Medina,
Mhm.
look about universities in Almaty, and this this training of pre-service teachers. And again, it's heavily focused on specifically disability. And again, that disability is typically what we see visibly, not what we see invisibly, you know. And so rather than using the word disability, we should just be looking at barriers to learning, you know, because barriers to learning, when we talk about inclusive education, we talk about barriers to learning. Now, whether they be disability, whether they be ethnicity, whether they be language, whether they be socioeconomic status or gender or religion or whatever they are, there are barriers to learning. So what we face, you know, one of the challenges we face here with the idea or the conceptualization or the practices and implementation, you know, of policy into inclusive education is this idea of inclusive education as disability, as something that we can see. But if we turned our attention and turned that word off for a moment and just understood inclusive education as barriers to learning, and again, the understanding that inclusion is not inclusive education. And that was another point that was actually raised when we talk about integration and we talk about 70% of schools becoming inclusive. Now, I've been to inclusive schools in Kazakhstan and they're integrated. They have correctional classes. You know, we still have these typical kind of ideas where you go into a class, the desks are lined up, the students, you know, put up their hand, the teacher nods and the student stands up beside their desk and they, you know, and they speak and then they sit down. And then the student that may have some, you know, additional needs is sitting with a tutor and they're actually just working with a tutor. They're not really necessarily engaging with the teacher or with the rest of the class. They're off to the side. So, you know, there's a lot of kind of the way that these things are conceptualized, the way that they're understood are inherent barriers to that. So yes, there's more of an awareness, particularly in the school systems like the NIS system with teachers there, the understanding of hidden disabilities, the understanding of dyscalculia or dyslexia or other, you know, or autism. And but there's still not necessarily the training there. Okay, and that same thing goes and plays out into the medical sphere as well. There's still not the training there of defectologists, and even the name defectologist is problematic because we go back, you know, and look at Vygotskian theory, and Vygotsky said, you know, the primary two forms of disability, a primary and a secondary. And primary, the child is you know, has a disability that's normal for the child. However, it's what society does that is disabling. It's an exclusionary, and those kinds of practices or structures that are inherently with society, within societies that are exclusive and create a greater disability for the child.
Thank you so much. And I think your conclusion is also resonates with Galina's conclusion that teachers also have to be prepared and also trained and in many cases supported in this process. And I myself had a teaching experience of students and it's shocking that sometimes even in the UK higher education, some of the university professors are not necessarily supported. So this problem, I think, is quite international at its scope, which unfortunately reflects that there are so many barriers that still exist. And I think you framed it in a very holistic way of talking about it as barriers, and also the importance of reshaping the discourses and the narratives and the meaning of categories and names. So thank you so much for that. So all the participants are warmly invited to type questions in the discussion box, and I see we have quite a few colleagues joining us. So if there are no questions yet, I will ask a question that I had for Medina, a methodological question. You mentioned diaries as a data collection tool. So, and you also reflected on how COVID might affect your data collection fieldwork. So are you planning to conduct digital diaries, or what are your thoughts on this?
Thank you for your question, Olga. Well, I'm still in the process of framing all these, stages, and I think with the impact of COVID-19, I will definitely put more specific modifications, amendments into my work, and I'm still in the process of discussing it with my supervisors. And in terms of diaries, research diaries, I myself have a diary. Have a research diary which I started when I went to Hungary and started my PhD study. So that is one of the ideas. I think I mentioned at some point the statistical data from Central Asian countries on disability, like numbers in different aspects like higher education or school education or special boarding schools or homeschooling. All of these points will be considered and involved into my work.
Thank you. So we have two additional questions. I think one is for everyone, and one is for Medina. Just a clarification question, I think, from Mirjahan about the 086 medical form.
Yeah, it's one of the how do you call it, spravka, I think. One of the documentation, disability-related documentation. And what was the question exactly? Sorry.
So the question is whether you have any thoughts to share about this form.
No, thank you for your question. I'm still in the process of, like building up the documentation. I've touched the topic on PMPK and of tech and all of these, disability process related institutions and commissions. But I will look at that point too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Medina. And the question to all panelists is, so it's quite an ambitious question. So what are the long-term or short-term plans to reach the level of equality or equity, or to replace the barriers in the education system of Kazakhstan? So this is a question from Akmarjan. So what are your thoughts? When do you think we would be able to build a more inclusive society, I guess? So
I just speak briefly to that. It is a holistic thing. Okay, it's a holistic. It's not just one thing that we need. I typically frame it in this way. If we're going to speak really broadly, but if we say plans, whose plans for a start? Whose plans to do this? And so yes, the government has a will, but often things are implemented or laws come into place, but there's no coherent kind of alignment with any particular policy down into the school level or into teacher training. So I put it into three spheres: philosophy, skills, and knowledge. Okay, so there's one thing to have the skills and knowledge, but if you don't have the right attitudes or understanding of inclusive education, it won't work. You can have the right philosophy, but if you don't have the skills and knowledge, it's still problematic. So broadly, across the board, we've got to actually look at what are the skills. Well, what are the skills that teachers need? What are the skills that pre-service education, educators need? What's the knowledge that teachers need? What's the knowledge of pre-service teacher educators? What's the broader understanding or philosophies around inclusion that need to be developed? And this is a slow process, because it's not just a provision of resources, it's not just a provision of policy, it's how it's understood, it's how it's enacted, and there must be a coherence all the way from the top level of policy right down into school level. Now, we have inclusive education policies in some schools. Nobody knows what to do with them. No one knows how to enact them. No one knows what this means, or people just want to ignore them because it seems to be too hard. And the understanding of inclusive education, it's not just a thing that happens in a school. It requires inclusive practices. okay, in educational context. So it's not just doing what you've always done in your school somehow and your classroom's going to be magically inclusive. It is the employment of specific pedagogical approaches like universal design for learning, like differentiation, understanding the environment and the environmental changes you can make within a classroom, understanding the kinds of curriculum differentiation or teaching differentiation that you want to employ, addressing the needs as a student-centered approach to teaching. Now, typically in the post-Soviet context, back 10 years ago, we've not had a teacher-centered approach, a student-centered approach. It's been a teacher-centered approach. The teacher stands there, the teacher teaches, and if the student doesn't understand, it's the student's fault. So it's the individualization of deficit. The problem is with the student, not the teacher. When we turn that model around and we say, okay, let's look at the teacher, let's look at how we can equip teachers with the understanding that they can, employ certain practices to best address the needs of individual students in the classroom. And that, unfortunately, in teachers' minds, is an idea that it's going to be creating more work, and this is what I say to my students. They say, oh, but it's more work for the teacher. Actually, it's not, because when we're planning for diversity, we're not retrofitting. We're not trying to do this for this student, and this for this student, and this for this student. But when we're actually planning for a classroom of diverse needs, we're putting into place materials that are appropriate for that. So unfortunately, that understanding, that knowledge, and those skills are just not there within the educational sphere as yet. So teachers have this idea that they're going to continue to teach the way that they've always taught. And somehow spend more time with this child, and parents are afraid that their child's not going to get the same amount of attention in the classroom because there's a child with disability. But there's the idea here, when we talk about assessment as well, that every child must get a 5, that the teacher's no good unless every child in the classroom gets a 5. There's been the rewarding of teachers who've had students participating in Olympiads and things like that. So they become master teachers. We've got to change that philosophy. We've got to change that. A really good teacher is able to address the needs of all students in the class, not just the ones that are, the ones that are just going to excel or have limited barriers to education anyway. So that understanding of what an educator is, what the skills, what the philosophy, and what the knowledge they need to have is something that we need to be developing here in Central Asia.
Thank you so much. And I think this relates to the conclusions by Janat and Galina in terms of the scope of the challenges, and that the parental inclusion is key. And Galina also highlighted that if families have such significant financial struggles, will have they're choosing between buying bread or food versus, of putting extra resources into schooling. So I don't know if Janat and Galina, you would like to make some final remarks perhaps on the moving forward, especially that you are in your final stages of PhD research. Maybe you have some tips for Medina or some thoughts on future events or discussions. The floor is yours. It would be good to hear what you think.
Can I please add my thoughts following Professor Samuelsen's discussion about the holistic approach? And I just wanted to say that there are positive practices in schools, and unfortunately, when these practices are being implemented, there is a lack of transferability into the school, like everyday practices. So when the project is implemented, it works for 1 or 2 years for the duration of the project. But when the project finishes, unfortunately, schools don't know how to move on, carry on with the same practices. And again, it is considered in policies and reports as an inclusive practice, but then children and parents, they fall behind of so that's one of the again points to make, that even when there are projects to implement, we need to consider the transferability and just to consider the school capacity, how they can learn and how they can carry on with these positive practices. Thank you.
Galina?
I think in the case of Uzbekistan, we are very close to what just Janat said. We had a lot of inclusive education projects being implemented in Uzbekistan. Although there were pilot projects, but teachers were expected to continue on their own after projects were completed. And we had the same problem. First, our local schools, they do not have financial resources to work on. And the second reason is, I think, teachers are often not motivated to work on their own. And even though they were trained and they were expected to be multiplicators of the knowledge, they didn't do that because many of them left their positions. So I talked to the implementers of inclusive education during my data collection, and they said, we have trained teachers, but then they just disappeared. And we had to train a new group of teachers again, and we did not know what to expect. And it's a time and it's our resources. So I think this is a problem because as I have briefly mentioned in my presentation, all those initiatives, they have to be mainstreamed in the national policy. And only in that case, we can talk about sustainability. If they are not in the national policy, then it's just like initiatives here and there with no continuation. And this is a problem. And I also think attitudes are very important. And as my professor said, it's easy to think about attitudes, but it's actually the most difficult thing to change. It's something that in our minds, because we can have policies in place, we can even have resources budgeted for implementation and of inclusive education initiatives, but our attitudes, this is what actually is a big barrier, and it takes time. It's very difficult to answer this question, how long it may take. As one of my participants, she was quite upset, and she said, even in the nearest 50 years, we'll probably not see inclusive society in Uzbekistan. I do believe we can achieve it, but it's all about our attitudes and then I think policies and resources and all other things. And in our case, unfortunately, this is the Soviet legacy, and plus, as I also said, it's a lot of cultural barriers. It's a lot of cultural barriers that we have to overcome.
Thank you so much, Galina. And just in time, Ziad has a follow-up question for you. Whether you have any thoughts on inclusive education practices in Uzbek universities, and what is the current state of higher education inclusion for specifically persons with disabilities? What is the rate of enrollment? Are there any support mechanisms in place? But basically, if you could just perhaps in brief outline what is the situation in inclusive higher education in Uzbekistan.
So inclusive education in higher institution this is not actually my course I'm doing on a secondary level, but as long as I know, we do not have established practices so far. Because recently I was in touch with one of my colleagues from the Westminster University in Tashkent, and it's one of the leading institutions in Uzbekistan. And I think at this stage they're just preparing a program for teachers to train them for inclusive education. And so that's why I do not think that the national universities, because they do not have that high status and position as the Westminster University. So I do not think we have had any inclusive education practices so far. I might be wrong, but again, because it's not my topic, I mean, inclusive education higher ed, I cannot say exactly.
Thank you so much.
About Uzbekistan.
Could you please introduce yourself? So is it Ziad?
No, this is Mirjahan. I'm from Uzbekistan. To the same question which was asked Galina, I just wanted to give a little bit more information on this about higher education policy. So in Uzbekistan, I think it was in 2018, there is a new policy was adopted that higher education institutions should have like the annual enrollment, there should be 2% of students with disabilities should be accepted to the higher institutions in Uzbekistan. So, but I mean, that's a very broad, very big information. But when you go into practicing this policy, there are a lot of different questions come up. Okay, what kind of disabilities? What are the accessibilities? are they really being having like reasonable accommodation, and what are the criteria? What disabilities to be? I mean, there are a lot of bunch of questions to be rolled out that policy. So that's just quick addition. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much for this very much welcome addition. And I think as our webinar is almost reaching to its end, I had a final question whether speakers had questions to each other. And I think we could just end with the final remarks from speakers. If you have and if not, then thank you so much. Michelle?
Yes, I'll just, I want to say thank you so much for inviting me along today just to give and I just wanted to give a brief overview on the kind of, research that I've been involved in since, I arrived here, and the research that some of our students have been involved in. And actually, Ziad is one of our former master's students here at Azerbaiyán University. So I want to thank the other speakers today, Galina, Zanat, and where had Medina, there you are, and thank you the wonderful work that's contributing to the development of inclusive education in the Central Asian context. And I think really this is a way forward, and the more research that's being done, the more light we can show on some of the challenges and the problems, not just only for teachers but also for parents and for educational institutions in general. So I just want to thank everybody for the research that you're doing and the time you've taken to present today, and it's been an absolute pleasure to be part of this. So thank you, Olga, as well, for organising this and for inviting me along to join.
I would like to also thank everyone for persisting and for contributing to the webinar. And I also wanted to thank the Kazakh PhD Student Association in the UK and Alias Imbaeva for supporting us. And also special thanks go to Camila, who was managing the online participation and very swiftly coordinating with me, so swiftly that unfortunately we blocked by accident my colleague from Oxford, for which we are sorry, but we were really happy to organize this webinar. And to reiterate, this was the first doctoral webinar for the Comparative and International Special Interest Group at BIRA, the first webinar focusing on Central Asia. For us, it was important to have Central Asian scholars presenting in dialogue with international researchers and with established professors. So we hope this is the first event, and maybe many more will follow up at Kira or at other organizations. And we were quite happy to have what I call an inclusive webinar on inclusive education, having multiple voices and diverse speakers represented. So thank you so much. Even the discussion itself is important for doctoral students and for the members of the audience. Representatives of the NGO sector I see in the list of participants, and largest student organizations. So thank you so much once again, everyone. And I will write my email address in the communication box, and you can find my email also on the website of Oxford University. If you have any questions or suggestions, let me know. I'll be happy to introduce speakers or to each other or participants. So thank you so much, everyone, for participating again. And I apologize again for the first 5 minutes of the webinar. So thank you so much. And I hope you have a great day or evening, wherever you are.
Thank you.
Thank you, Olga.
May I just add? Yeah, just wanted to add. Thank you, Olga, for organizing this event during this, very unclear, unstable time with the coronavirus outbreak. It was great pleasure to be with all of you, to share my experience, to share ideas and our work. And it was especially a great pleasure to see Dr. Samartan, because we have been in touch like a few years ago. We've been discussing my PhD topic, and I'm happy to see you today and to discuss with you the topic we all are working on. And I hope we will share more ideas in the future and projects. And I'm also always happy to collaborate, because I really believe in collaboration, which is still one of the weak points, I think, or maybe it's like stopping point in inclusive education development in our region. But we have to work on it. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining, and have a great day.